everyone. So what we want to do is open up our Blender app. We want to go to new file. You can click on general to get a new file. I've already started my own file, which is Nintendo Switch. I've selected everything by clicking A and just click delete, or X to get rid of everything to start with a clean slate, because first what we want to do is add a Nintendo Switch, an actual Nintendo Switch. Just drag and drop to Blender. Once we're in Blender, we can now center the Nintendo Switch, and of course we can scale it up. So you can center it into the middle and scale it up a little bit, move it up along the Z axles. There we go. And click Control S to save. Always remember to save your items. First thing we want to do is get a plane. So Shift A. Now that we have a plane, we would like to rotate this plane on the X axis by 90 degrees and scale it up a little bit. We want to just scale it up and make sure that it fits on top of our template, because the Nintendo Switch currently is just our template. Now scale this along the X axis. We can click Alt Z for X-ray mode. Now what we'd like to do is to create some loop cuts. So click Control R to create 2 loop cuts. Then with these loop cuts, we can actually click SX to scale these along the X axis. There we go, looking pretty good so far. Once we got all of these vertices selected in the center, we can actually click I to insert, and then we can scale these in a much better way as well. Click on these 2 edges and we can scale these along these Z axles, just like that, because we're going to want to bezel these corners as well. Once again, with the face selected, with the inner face selected, we can insert once again, because we've got the display a little bit further down. We can scale it along in whichever form we like, to be honest, just to make sure it's a little bit more centered. So now that we've got the edge vertices selected, click Control B and V. And now we can obviously scale these along the edges, and that tends to look pretty well. That tends to look pretty good, to be honest. So once you're happy with the scaling, you can then click. So once you're happy with that, click right click. You've got everything selected. You can actually now extrude the edges. So double click A. So select A to select all of our vertices. Now we can actually just extrude backwards, and it's not a very thick object. So if we click on number 3 on our number pad, you can clearly see we don't have to make it too thick. And I think just about there is quite perfect. And now that you've got your object, what we can do is duplicate this object and hide duplication by clicking on H. So now so just in case we mess something up, we can always get that object back because we've duplicated it. So let's go back into edit mode and let's click Alt Z. And now what we want to do is start modeling these buttons. So let's start with the X button right there. Shift right click to put your cursor above there, and what we want in this object is basically a cylinder. So let's Shift A and get a cylinder. Now that we've got that cylinder, we can actually just rotate the cylinder on the X axis 90 degrees. Alt Z to go back into X-ray mode, and then we can scale this object down. That looks pretty good. Now that we've got our button, we can actually go to our modifiers tab, and what we can do is click bezel. Let's put the amount up to around 0.45, I'd say. Let's put our segment up a little bit. So that actually looks pretty good, quite low poly. And if you wanted to look better, you can just shade smooth, and now it looks pretty much great. So naturally, we'd like to duplicate this object. So Shift D to duplicate the object and move it down on the Z axis. And click on both objects, and what we can do is simply duplicate these objects and then rotate them on the Y axis. You can rotate them like that, 90 degrees, and they're perfectly rotated just like that. Obviously it doesn't look like it's fully centered, so what you can always do is click on this object right there and you can move it around to fully center it if you'd like. But me personally, I'm not going to center it in this video because we want to have a good idea of what it would look like on its own. Let's click Control S to save all of this. You can see the buttons are a little bit protruded, so what we can do is actually just click on all of them, go to our side view and move these buttons down a little bit, just a little bit, because we don't want it to be too protruded. Once again, Control S to save. So with all these objects, we can select them all, and you probably know what I'm going to do. I'm going to duplicate them all and just simply bring them across on the opposite side. Just like that. That looks pretty damn good. But if you think they are not protruding enough, you can always adjust them and bring them out on the y-axis just a little bit. And it's the same thing with these ones. You can select them all and bring them out just a little bit on the y-axis, and until it looks perfect to your liking. So with the rest of our objects, we just want to create the rest of our objects, such as this little knob on the left hand corner. So let's shift A and let's create a cube. So now that we have a cube, we can just adjust this cube, scale it down a little bit, adjust it on the z-axis as well. And from the edge view, there you have it. It looks quite nice. Scale it down a little bit, and there you have it. Let's move our background image backwards a little bit so it's not affecting the way we do things. And it's a similar thing with this button right there. We can actually just duplicate this button and bring it down. Just use the duplication button for this object right there. And naturally, we probably want this button to be a little bit different. So what we can do is actually we can adjust the amount of bezel that we're given this, because we naturally want this button to be a little bit flatter. So it doesn't actually need a lot of segments. So just around 4 segments would do. And bring this button in just a little bit. It protrudes a little bit, but not too much, and save this object. So now it's starting to look much better. If we duplicate our background image and move it along the x-axis, you can see that that's starting to look a little bit better. So there's a little button on the right hand corner. So this will be the next button that we create, and this will actually be quite simplistic. Shift right click, put your cursor right above the little button, and let's go for a plane. So now that we have a plane, we actually want to rotate this plane on the x-axis 90 degrees and scale this plane down. So with this plane selected, we can tab in and we can actually start to add some loop cuts. So 2 loop cuts right there, quite perfect, and 2 loop cuts right there. Now select the outer edges, not all of them, just the edges we don't need. So select these vertices on the edges that we don't need, and we can just delete those vertices. Now that everything is looking pretty good, we can actually just extrude this just a little bit, not too much, and bring this into our object, starting to look very nice. Then we can actually just add a bezel just to make it look a little bit better, and that looks pretty good. Shade smooth, and it looks more lovely. So there's an additional button that we need to create, and that's this little button on the left hand corner at the bottom right there. So let's put our cursor right there, and let's get our cube, scale our cube down, and that's our cube so far, looking so good. Now on top of this cube, what we can actually create is a circle. Rotate the circle on the x-axis 90 degrees and scale this circle down. And let's bring our circle outwards. So now that we've got our circle, select the circle and we will add a new modifier. This is called a shrink wrap. And our target, we click on the object. Now they looked almost attached. So let's click back onto our cube. So now that we've shrink wrapped this to our object, what we actually want to click on for method is to project this object. We want to project it on the y-axis. Now that we've got our circle selected and it's shrink wrap, we've got y-axis selected. Let's click on negative and let's deselect positive. So once it's on Y and it's on positive, everything is connected. We go to apply, we tab into our cube, and we would like to create some loop cuts for our cube. So just scale this along the x-axis, add a couple additional loop cuts, scale this along the z-axis, move this along on the z-axis, face select, and let's delete this face by pressing X and then click in face, and then that's deleted. So with these objects, we now want to join these objects, Control J to join both objects, and tab in and go to vertices selector, and now we can connect these vertices. So what we'll need is some additional loop cuts for these areas. We'll need some additional loop cuts on the opposite side. So now what we can do is to connect these loop cuts, click face, and that's how you connect your loop cuts. Pretty simple actually. Let's continue to connect our loop cuts. So now you just need to connect all of these loop cuts little by little, and you can watch me do mine. If you have any problem, you can just replay my clip to watch me figure all of these out. Most of them are simple, but if you have any problem, it is good to just rewatch what you've done previously to try to figure it out for yourself. And we can just continue adding our loop cuts just like that. So there we have it. We have our little circle created, and we will be using this method more than once. So let's select only the vertices in our circle. We can click F to fill to give it a face, and then we can extrude along the y-axis just inwards a little bit, and we can actually bezel the innermost area of our cube, of our circle. So now that we've got that, that's looking pretty good. So like I said, we will be using this more than once. Let's put this into our object a little bit more, and let's add a bezel modifier. We want to tab in and we want to bezel the edges just like that. So now back to our objects. What we want to create is these two little buttons on the opposite side, both opposite side. So now to get our button on the left, we want to try something a little bit different. We're going to add a cube right there on our left. We're going to scale this cube up just a little bit like that, and we want to scale the cube down. Put this cube within the object just like that, and tab into the cube, go to edge select. Now that we've got the edge selected, we can actually bezel this cube down just like that. So with everything selected, we can then move the cube out somewhat and bring the cube down, of course. So we can position the cube to our liking, to be honest, and we can scale the cube down a little bit more on the y-axis and bring it inward into the actual object, so it looks a little bit better just like that. So now that we've got that done, we can actually do a loop cut on this object. Now that we've got this selected, we can do a loop cut on opposite sides of the object. We can bring that down just a little bit, and what we can do is just get rid of the bottom vertices if we'd like, and we can just click X to delete vertices. Now of course we are left with the top view, but the top view looks pretty good. Now what would happen if we add a solidity modifier? This gives our object some thickness, which is exactly what we need. And let's bring this inward, and that looks pretty lovely. Look at that. So now that we have our solidity modifier, we can actually add an additional modifier, subdivision modifier. Let's make sure our subdivision modifier is below the solidity modifier. So with our subdivision modifier, we can actually increase the level of viewport, increase the render to about 3. So now you can see it's not looking the best. What we can actually do is add some additional loop cuts. We can add a loop cut to the edge right there. We can add an additional loop cut to this edge over there. So now this object is looking pretty good. We can actually shade smooth just to get that finishing touch, and we can now duplicate this object and essentially rotate this object on the z-axis 1 inch red and 80 degrees. Then we can actually just move this object down, and if we go back into face select, we can just position this object to make sure it looks a little bit better. So just about there, looks pretty good. Position it on the y-axis a little bit more into the center of the object. There we go. So just like that, that's actually looking pretty good so far. So now that we've got that done, we can actually continue with modeling the rest of our object, and we haven't got much left, to be honest. We literally have 2 buttons left to model, so that's actually quite lovely.